So gun control is a very controversial topic in America, and over 85 Americans get killed every day due to gun violence. And there are people on both sides of the fence regarding the issue. People who view it in a positive way because it's protection for their families or it serves as income or food for their families, or people who see it in a negative light because gun violence has had such a negative effect on America. And when you're looking at gun control, you have to consider all the stakeholders in the situation. And you also have to look at ethics and the Madison Collaborative and how they play into the situation. Because gun control is a very sensitive topic in America today, and you have to be able to incorporate all the different things and look at how it affects the whole picture. And then this picture just has statistics on guns, like how many guns there are in America and how many people were killed by guns in 2009.
In order to understand exactly why we have guns, you should examine the Second Amendment, because it grants citizens the rights to bear arms. According to the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Although the Second Amendment is small and short and brief, it also makes it very, very vague. So, in order to understand what is considered necessary, you should understand if it is a state's right to form a militia or if it is an individual's right. Some people would say that it is state rights to form a militia because it is a protection of government and the state is an extension of government. But according to editorial, it is an individual right because in order to be a part of a militia, you have to supply your own weapons. In order to bear arms, you are allowed to conceal and have weapons. It does not necessarily mean it is not limited to guns only. Also, people like to say that the Second Amendment is a protection of the government. But if that were true, that would mean that 9 amendments in the Bill of Rights is a protection of the individual, while 1 is a protection of the government. And also, according to Young, that would mean that the First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendment refer to an individual when they use the term people, but the Second Amendment refers to multiple people, as in the government, and society when it's used. Also, if the Second Amendment is a protection of the individual's right, then it is a protection against government because government was seen as a way to take away from freedom, and it was considered only a necessary evil by the framers of the Constitution. So in order to completely understand what is meant, you should examine what the framers actually believed about government. They saw government as necessary to be small in order to ensure freedom but not be big enough to take away from freedom. And according to Thomas Jefferson, a government big enough to give you everything you want is strong enough to take everything you have. Now, lastly, the ethical questions raised about the Second Amendment need to be put into perspective. For responsibility is, it could be considered a civic duty to own weapons, similar to voting, as you need to protect your freedom with guns. And the outcome of removing your gun rights would be the loss of your own protection and the loss of force that you have over government, because you can no longer enforce your power over them. And according to Washington Times, guns are the first line of defense against government. Authority is your own government. So if your government were to say that you can no longer have guns, if your authority can say that you no longer have guns, they're oppressing your freedom. And would that truly make them your authority? Mm-hmm. Also, according to Thomas Jefferson, to question authority is the nature of freedom. Liberty is called into this as it conflicts with authority in the matter of removing your own gun rights. And protecting gun rights is a part of protecting your own freedom. Lastly, rights. By the Second Amendment, you're given the right to own weapons as it is considered a freedom to have. But if you were to remove the right to bear arms, you are removing your own freedom.
So the right to bear arms gives people the ability to use guns for protection. And in a Pew research in February 2013, it showed that nearly half of gun owners said that their main reason for owning a gun was for protection. And many men and women agree that guns also give them a sense of security. And this is also shown in a Pew research. And it stated that 80% of women gun owners say that having a gun makes them feel safer, and 79% of men say the same. Guns can also be seen as a thing that helps with self-defense. In the Supreme Court case District of Columbia versus Heller in 2008, it was when the District of Columbia regulated a gun restrictions for the citizens, saying that they could not hold handguns. And this was eventually voted down, saying that the Second Amendment gives people the right to own guns for self-defense. Another person that sees the Second Amendment this way is Nelson Loon, and he stated on April 17th, 2014, the Second Amendment commentators sought to establish that the Constitution does protect an individual right to have weapons for self-defense, including defense against criminal violence that the government cannot or will not prevent. Along with protection and self-defense, guns are also seen as one of the 8 key questions, which is fairness. And this is seen when people have to own guns for their properties or farms, for like protection for their animals or wildlife around them. And in a USA Today poll, it showed that many people that had properties like this that were big said that stricter gun laws would not allow them to protect it as much. And in bigger areas like rural areas, more people own guns because of the amount of land. And this is seen in another Pew research, which showed that 39% own guns in rural areas and 18% in urban areas. And when looking at states individually, this was an article on About.com. It stated that Wyoming is the highest percentage of state population owning a gun at 59.7%, and Virginia comes in at 35.1% of state owning a gun.
It is shown that guns are used for protection and self-defense, but many people also rely on guns for hunting, for food, and a source of income. Interesting facts about this graphic are 12.5 million people hunt illegally in the U.S. That means 7% of the country hunts. There are many dangers when it comes to hunting. A negative example could be if a child were to access a gun from a hunter's stash and therefore using the gun in an unsuited manner. This could tie into the Madison Collaborative under the subject of responsibility. If a hunter were more responsible with the way they kept their guns locked up, then a child wouldn't be able to access them so simply. Another negative example would be friendly fire in the forest. Friendly fire would be mistakenly injuring or killing another hunter by mistaking them for game or another target. Hunting can alter a population immensely fast. Although hunting is needed to fluctuate the population of animals, without hunting, animals would reach carrying capacity, which is when a biological species reaches its max population size in a given area. This would in turn kill more animals and cause a worse decline of that population in a certain place. This could also tie into the Madison Collaborative under outcomes. Without hunting, the outcome of the population would be it reaching its carrying capacity. Although there are positive outcomes like managing carrying capacity, there are more negative outcomes like gun violence occurring in rural areas.
Obviously, one negative thing that comes with guns is the gun violence, and people often tend to focus on gun control after a serious gun incident occurs, and there are a range of vital issues surrounding gun violence. According to Learn What It Takes to Keep America Safe on everytown.org, Americans are 20 times more likely to be murdered with a gun than people in developing countries. Unfortunately, another common gun violence occurrence is school shootings. One of the most recent and well-known school shootings happened in Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. This school shooting resulted in the death of 20 children and 6 adults. As reported by Everytown for Gun Safety on everytown.org, there have been 74 school shootings since Newtown, as you can see that picture. Background checks can do a lot to help prevent gun violence. The article Background Checks stated that 16 states in the capital require a criminal background check for all gun sales. In these states, 38% fewer women are shot to death and killed by their partners. 39% fewer on-duty police officers were killed. 49% fewer people commit suicides with guns, and there's 48% less gun trafficking. However, the background check system is not flawless, and there are some evident loopholes in it. For example, federal law requires that only licensed sellers require a background check. Therefore, guns can be bought through private sellers or online without a background check. As stated in the article Background Checks, felons, domestic abusers, the seriously mentally ill, and other dangerous people know about this loophole and exploit it every day. Although there are some evident flaws in the background check system, since it has started, it has blocked over 2 million sales. This deals with the Madison Collaborative question of outcomes, because are background checks producing the best short-term and long-term outcomes with the positives and negatives of background checks. People often also tend to correlate mental illness with gun violence, and the article Connection Between Mental Illness and Gun Violence, written by Louis Beckett in the Pacific Standard, features a 2001 study that looked at 34 mass murders committed by male teens. 70% of these male teens were described as loners, 61.5% had previous problems with substance abuse, 48% had preoccupation with weapons, 43.5% were victims of bullying, but only 23% documented psychiatric history. This means that 3 out of the 4 men did not. So sometimes this issue of mental illness is overlooked, but it's still a very serious issue. Federal law requires that if you have been involuntarily hospitalized for a mental illness, you are prohibited from buying a gun. So people may look at this immediately as a great law, but if you look further into it, you realize that it deals with the question of rights and if the rights of the individual are being protected. For example, someone could have previously had a mental illness and recovered from it, but they were still involuntarily hospitalized at one point in their life, so they still aren't able to buy a gun. Or to look at the other end of it, someone could have a mental illness but have not yet been hospitalized for it, and they're able to buy a gun. So this really deals with the question of fairness and is this law fair? There's also often failures to send and update records into the background check system. An example of this is the Virginia Tech shooter who killed 32 people. He went to court and was declared to have a serious mental illness. However, his records were not updated into the background check system, so he was able to pass the background check. Overall, gun control is a serious and controversial issue, and we have presented to you numerous stances on the issue, and there are many different stakeholders that make this issue more complex and difficult to handle.
Okay, so as you can see from the presentation, gun control has created a lot of issues and debates. And from the survey that we took in class, guns have affected a lot of the students, whether they hunted and their families hunt, or they were affected by a school or neighborhood shooting. So it's clearly something that affects a lot of Americans. And when somebody is forming an opinion on gun control or the government is making decisions on it, they have to look at all the stakeholders and all the people that it affects, whether it's people who use it as protection or for hunting or who don't want guns because it's affected their family negatively. You have to look at all sides of the story, and you have to look at the different key questions like fairness and rights and responsibilities, and make sure that those are looked at and taken into consideration as well when you're making a decision about gun control.
Great.